Hello, welcome to the first episode of Practical Evolution podcast. Today we're going to be talking about self-improvement and spirituality. We are driving in a car today and we have a special guest, Sophie Jones, also known as my girlfriend. And welcome, Sophie. You have the privilege of being the first guest on the podcast.
Yes, thank you. Hello everyone.
And we're sort of figuring this out, and we're just going to sort of free flow conversation, talk about how self-improvement has helped us and how it sort of has evolved over the years, and
set the scene a bit, I guess.
Set the scene, if you will. So, to start off with, what is self-improvement? We can just start defining some terms.
Mm-hmm.
And self-improvement to me is kind of like the current cultural trend or cultural sort of theme in the zeitgeist, where people want to improve themselves, people sort of invest into their body, their health, their mind, maybe their career to some degree, and their skills that are relevant to those topics. And it sort of doesn't necessarily touch on the metaphysical. It's all very physical, it's all very mental. And I think self-improvement is a great place to start, and there's so many different categories and avenues you can explore. And self-improvement really helped me when I was sort of younger.
Just to touch on what you said, I think it's greater than just the current cultural trend of self-improvement. I think it's one of the things that defines us as humans versus animals, right? We have an innate desire to grow and to learn and improve and keep moving in that direction. I think it's probably quite innate in most people if you're not getting in the way of it. And I think you tend in that direction. But there is also the more cultural side of it. It's a bit of a trend more recently, and I'd say probably a positive trend because of that good.
Well, there's so many different sort of flavours of self-improvement, and if you look around and you're looking for self-improvement, you will see the more emergent, people focusing on health, people focusing on their physique, people focusing on leveling up in different ways. So more what you can observe around you is kind of what I was talking about. I think the more fundamental drive to improve as a human, I think some people obviously more ambitious than others, some people have different tendencies, and that's going to look different for everyone, how they with their interests and what they want to improve on. And
maybe we should start with what that looked like in the beginning for you.
Okay. So I definitely started off with sport and the gym, and I was always trying to improve my performance in sport. So I played rugby, I did swimming, I did gymnastics, I even did some extreme sports like kite surfing, snowboarding, wakeboarding, etc. And so I was always looking to improve my physical abilities, my coordination, my balance, my strategy in different ways. And so it was always, how can I be the most functional version of myself? And that's really how it started for me. And that could be as early as 15 years old. Started going to the gym to help with my rugby, and I was swimming before that and gymnastics before that, so that obviously all impacted my current physical state and how I decided to get into self-improvement. And it was very much I knew that if I put in the sort of delayed gratification mindset, I'm putting in effort now for results later, that it would eventually pay off. And that was something that I learned quite early on, and I started seeing results. Obviously, you stick to something for 6 months. I had a garage gym at the time. I was just, going in every evening while I was 15, 16 or whatever. I couldn't get a gym membership at the time. So I'm just there doing that for rugby, and I noticed that I start looking different. People start commenting I'm showing up differently, and obviously when you start working on your body, it has effects on your energy levels, maybe how much attention you can apply in school and stuff at the time. And you just notice different areas of your life sort of being impacted by weirdly just focusing on the body, and that was definitely how I started.
I was going to ask when or if any mindset and mind level things came into that.
Yeah, for sure. I think I always naturally tended towards, like, mindset-wise, on the stoic sort of mindset. And so it was always delayed gratification was like a very key component of how I viewed the world. And so I always knew that if I invested, like, outside of instant gratification, which is where a lot of people invest their time, in sort of the quick dopamine hits of the present, then if you sort of suffer in a weird way, like, it's what's the saying? It's like no pain, no gain sort of thing. And so that was I don't think that's a super beneficial way to view things, but it really helped me at the time.
Served you at the beginning.
Yeah, so it was very much like I knew if I put in hard work, it would pay off as results.
Yeah, I remember, like, when I first met you, one of the mindset things that stuck out was your, I don't know if believe is the right word, but like your mindset around focusing on the things that you can control, and only the things you can control.
Yeah.
I guess that also comes from the Stoicism too.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's all about embracing what is in front of you, not reacting to anything that is outside of your control. And yeah, it's like this radical responsibility for what you can do, and it's always the next step, the next step, the next step, and remaining like as equanimous as possible is sort of very ingrained in that. I think I started leaning into that probably a bit later, but I think the seeds were there from like my actual daily like practice and how I was showing up for life. Like,
yeah.
I think, yeah, I started applying it in the physical realm, but then that really quickly went into like my studies, my learnings, my curiosities, and so I ended up delaying other instant gratification to, you know, sharpen my mind or learn how to pay attention for hours at a time. And all of those sort of things, you start to realize everything's kind of a muscle, whether it's physical, mental, spiritual. Everything is kind of like, I don't think this is necessarily applicable to everything, but if you can like invest time into something, generally it levels up. And some things maybe are more constant, and we can maybe talk about that when we touch on spirituality, but there are so many different ways of viewing the world as areas or games to level up in, and sort of skills to level up in, and you start viewing the world as like a place where you can sort of build your character, you know, your interests, your being, your level of competence in so many different avenues. And it's almost like exciting because you end up generating a lot of meaning from life and a lot of passion for different areas. So yeah, what did it look like for you, Soph, like when you first started on your version of self-improvement?
Thinking back, the beginning of it for me was
Speak
probably...
up, please.
Sorry, thinking back, the beginning for me was probably more on the like mental aspect that you touched on the end there. Probably more to do with my studies, and I had like big goals and desires. I was like at a very high achieving school, so there was quite a lot of pressure to succeed, and I wanted that for myself. So it was more about like the discipline and again the longer term gain, so not focusing on instant gratification. I have many memories of like waking up early in the mornings before school and like studying for like doing loads of practice papers and practice tests, and knowing that putting that time in then would have results and would pay off in the end. So yeah, probably more from that side. The physical side of things, like more interested in health and fitness and all of those things, came later on for me. Even though I was quite active as a child, but I never really like thought about improving myself in those spaces. I just enjoyed movement. Yeah, that probably came more later when I met you. Yeah, that's where mine started.
Interesting. Yeah. And so how this sort of like evolves, I think, is like at the natural sort of, you start realizing that there's higher leverage things that you can improve, and they end up like cascading into other areas of your life.
Yes.
And so I think once you start understanding the concept of leverage, then you're like, well, what is if I'm going to invest all this time into improving myself, like what is actually the thing that's going to move the needle the most in the most possible avenues of my life?
Where's the best place for me to be putting that time and energy?
And so first off, you might think it's like exercising all the time, and obviously if it is a huge bottleneck and you're really suffering with your health, it probably is. That probably is the highest leverage point. But if you already have, like, you end up in a place where you're, you know, very healthy in body and you're strong and your mind is quite sharp and you're able to apply yourself and solve problems, I think you get to a point where there's more higher leverage to be had in the more subtle. Like, you start changing your beliefs about things. You maybe have an intention about different areas, and you start to realize that if you set a goal intentionally, or you start living your life in accordance to certain principles, that those things have more outlandish effects on your being and how you show up, and maybe even makes the other things happen more autonomously or effortlessly. And I think that's where you sort of get into the more mindset, the more spiritual realm, the more subtle realm, if you will.
I guess from a more practical perspective, like for people listening, how can they know what the next thing is? Because the thing that has the highest leverage changes over time, right? It's usually your current biggest bottleneck until that's no longer the biggest bottleneck, and then you're focusing on the next thing. But how can people identify what's the best next thing for them to invest their time and energy into to have the highest leverage improvement in their life?
Yeah. Okay. So it's generally, I think if you look at your life and you have a level of self-awareness where you can be honest with yourself, then you sort of know the areas that maybe you're struggling the most or you want to improve in the most. And I would say it is kind of like a self-awareness / intuitive thing. And so you have to be really honest with yourself, maybe do a bit of introspection, a bit of reflection on, all right, so I have all these areas of my life, but the number one priority for me right now is, you know, X, Y, Z, you know, my body, my career.
Often an outcome, right? It's outcome driven.
But then that outcome, effectively to achieve an outcome, you have to be someone else. And so there's this kind of principle that I definitely believe in that we're sort of touching on now, which is, if you were capable of doing something, it would already be the case. And so this takes a lot of humility to be like, well, actually I need to change for an outcome to emerge in my life. And so it's this radical sort of humility to be like, I'm not at the point where that goal is, you know, actualized. So that has come into reality. So it's identifying and saying, okay, based on this outcome, where do I need to change? Where do I need to show up? Where do I need to work on? So it's taking that radical responsibility based on self-awareness.
Yes, how do you become the person that has that outcome? Yeah. Right? What's between you and the person that would have that outcome?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's more impacting on the being level. So, like, how do you change the being that you're showing up as, that then that doing or that thing emerges from? It's not like, it's less about the doing, right? Less about something that you have to actually, that's hard to explain.
Well, yeah, I would say you're improving your capabilities, but on a more subtle level, you're actually building a new person. You know, you're becoming someone greater than you were before, because you've summoned that level of discipline for that amount of time, and, you know, you've stuck to something, you've achieved an outcome because you've become someone else.
Yeah.
And
Can we think of an example of this?
Yeah, so generally, like, if I wanted to become, so I did a computer science degree, I'm now a software engineer, and at one point it was like I wasn't so good at computer science, right? Like, I'm starting off my degree, I'm year one, imagine, and I'm like, all right, I really want to nail this, I want to become, you know, an expert in computer science, and I want to be a software engineer when I leave. So I set the intention, I show up, and I'm the most humble student, the most curious person. I want to learn how things work. I want to understand how great computer scientists think, and I sort of embed myself in this whole computer science frame of mind, and I have to change my being into effectively the identity of a computer scientist or a software engineer, right? So I have to have that incredible level of intention, that level of devotion, that level of commitment to then become the person who is now has the skills, has put in the time, has put in the work, understands these concepts because he genuinely wanted to know these things. And so you end up on the other side being a changed person and a better person for it.
Yeah.
And so it's a continual adaptive process, right?
Yeah, and you focus on that being aspect. But what in that scenario could it look like if you didn't take that lens and maybe be the less optimal way that you were striving for this outcome, not trying to change your being?
I think there's one way to do it, but there's 1,000 ways not to do it. So me like starting
path.
Yeah, there is one way to achieve something, and it's always, learning as much as possible, showing up, and not beating yourself up in lots of ways. And I can imagine lots of different ways now, millions of different ways there where you wouldn't be a good student or you wouldn't be learning, right? So if you're not looking after your mind or your body in certain ways, like maybe you're eating crap at uni, you're drinking every night, you're showing up to lectures and you're like, I don't really want to be here, and then you start giving yourself negative self-talk like, oh, I'm so bad at computer science, I'm never going to understand this concept's too hard. Or like you look at a lecturer and you're like, oh, I can never be like him, and your body is inflamed, your mind is weak and not sharp because you haven't been studying out of hours or something like that. Like you're setting yourself up for failure and you're self-sabotaging yourself, and there's a million ways you can self-sabotage yourself. And self-sabotage is kind of the inverse of self-improvement. It's like, rather than improving, I'm,
getting in your own way.
Yeah.
The
sayings just come to mind. It's like, easy choices, hard life, hard choices, easy life.
Yes.
So you make the hard choices, you end up having an easy life. And it sounds simple or cliche, but if you're faced with instant or delayed gratification and you take the delayed gratification, you end up with a life where you've built character, you've built discipline, you've built a level of respect for yourself, a level of confidence, a level of charisma. Because all those things are sort of, you have put in the work and you've proved to yourself that you can do things over and over again, and you've shown up in a way where you've changed as a person multiple times and you're continually evolving. And with these things, like, it's weird how doing hard things more persistently, it gets easier over time because you build momentum, you build like power, and like I said, you find things that have more leverage, the more subtle things that can move the needle far greater. So you end up becoming far more equipped and far more competent, and you have a tool set or a toolbox where you can effectively transcend all these different avenues of self-sabotage, these beliefs that you have, and improve more effectively, right?
Yeah, can you think of some like practical examples of some of these tools in your toolkit that might be useful for people to explore if they're interested?
Yeah, for sure. Like, I've read maybe too many books on these different things, different psychological, spiritual concepts, and that may not mean a lot to a lot of people, but if we just start on some that are serving me at the moment, but I've also, it's worth mentioning, I've tried other tools that worked for me for periods of time and I let go of them, I dropped them.
Maybe we start with some of the less like spiritual ones, some of the more like self-improvement based tools that might be more useful to start with.
Okay, so I would start with like the frame that you have programming and that you have an innate calling or purpose. And so this is probably where I started off at, is like I have certain ways that I'm viewing the world and beliefs about the world that are holding me back, and I would call these limiting beliefs. And this was very like self-improvement 101. You have beliefs that are limiting you. If you believe yourself to be a certain way or the world to be a certain way, you're actually creating that reality in front of you.
Yeah.
So your perceptions are your own bottlenecks. Your perceptions, your beliefs about yourself oh, I can't do this, I can't do that. They're the limit. And if you get rid of those limits, you actually end up actualizing more of your potential.
Yeah.
And the other side of that coin is that you also have like innate gifts and skills that is your purpose, it's your calling, and you're trying to continually peel back layers of the onion, if you will. And so you're continually trying to search for like, how can I best show up for the world? How can I best find my calling in its unique expression? Like, what am I single-handedly the best at? And in that way you find your uniqueness, you find your style, you find your purpose, your calling. Like, how can I best do this amalgamation of my genuine curiosities in the most courageous way possible?
I really like those two sides of that coin. I think some practical examples for me that I found quite useful. On the like limiting belief side, I found a tool of like affirmations quite useful. So when you do manage to like introspect and identify something that you are placing on yourself or placing on reality, which isn't real, it's something you're making up, like a belief, positively affirming the opposite is quite a useful way to like recontextualize your reality. For example, you might say that believe that you can't do something or something's not possible, and then affirming the opposite, and like almost rewiring the way you think. Also like changing your self-talk, so the way you're communicating with yourself 24/7 is basically creating your reality in a way, and being conscious of that and changing the way that you communicate with yourself can also recontextualize your reality. So one half was limiting beliefs, what was the other half again?
So purpose, calling, that sort of side of things.
On that side, I personally found that really hard to really understand what it was that was my true purpose. I think it's quite easy to develop a sense of this is what I'm going to do and this is who I'm going to be from what you think other people want from you, especially as a child. Like, you're kind of designed or like
social conditioning.
Social conditioning. You think that this is a good intellectual path, or this is something that would please people, or XYZ. But eventually at some point you maybe learn that those things don't satisfy you so much, or they don't feel like aligned with you, and you want to figure out what it is that's truly your purpose and your passion.
I would say sometimes you have to like explore things that aren't your purpose or calling. It's maybe like your best guess, right?
It's always, everything's always your best guess, right? But I think something that helped me figure out the things that I was truly passionate about was the things that brought me into a flow state, and those kind of activities and things that made it feel like hours would pass. Hours would pass in minutes, and I could be deeply immersed in things, and I would not want to stop doing them. I can think of like times when I was like sewing and creating clothes and like being creative, the lesson at school would just pass in a second, and I wouldn't want to leave, and felt like I could
That's great.
Stay up all night and do those kind of things. Like, that's a real signal that those are things that you're innately attuned to be good at and enjoy.
Naval says on that same point, it's like, what are you doing that feels like play but looks like work to others?
Exactly.
And so what are these things that you end up just diving into and exploring, and you're playing with all these different things, you're solving these like problems, and you love doing it, and it's like, what is that, and what is that for you, and what does that look like, and how unique and how broad is that, and how deep is it within like your desire to actualize that into your life and into the future and into the present, and how you're going to work on that now and invest time into it. I think that is just a continual journey, and both of these are continual journeys, right? So it's and I think it is the more practical aspect of these concepts, the two sides of it, the programming and the purpose. And so once you sort out to like a threshold, right? Once I'm like fairly confident in my calling and purpose, and I've discovered all these things that I'm amazingly interested in, it's kind of time to work. And then once you've got rid of all these things that are in the way of your beliefs and all these limits that used to exist, maybe they were put there by yourself or society or your parents, once you sort of get rid of these different limits, then it's time to work. Like, it's the same sort of like once I've done this inner work, it's time to outer work sort of concept. And I think that's, it's a beautiful thing. And I think that's probably the tipping point from self-improvement to more spiritual concepts.
So maybe we should now touch on some more of those spiritual concepts and how that started to come about in our journey, and how this like self-improvement mindset, we started to dive deeper and we did discover spirituality.
Yeah. So big shout out to David R. Hawkins. I've read like all of his books. I would start with Power Verse 4, so if you're looking into it. And letting go was a huge like pivotal practice that I've implemented. And it's arguably equivalent to mindfulness or contemplation. But just the mere fact that you can almost leverage your consciousness or your awareness to observe a sensation actually lets go of that attached energy, that maybe that blockage. And to me that is equivalent to these psychological structures we were just talking about, like limiting beliefs, etc., or like getting to a deeper level of your purpose. Like they're somehow synonymous in like a weird way.
I feel like we dove head first there. Maybe we should like touch on what spirituality means. I tend to
dive head first.
But for people that aren't really aware of the concept so much,
spirituality is like the highest leverage possible self-improvement via like mediums of consciousness. That is generally how I would define it.
So it's like self-improvement, but no longer just on the plane of the body or the mind.
Yeah,
it's like greater than that.
You could say metaphysical, you could say conscious, you could say awareness. It's all these things that sort of reside on that. That like even beyond mental, right? It's even beyond.
Yeah, I think for me, I got into that realm via more like the energetic realm. So like understanding things like chakras and the yogic culture, and like the energy body was almost like the step between that. So once I was like learning about the physical body and how I can like master that, then learning about this more energetic body then led to like the next level above that, which is more like this spiritual body, I guess you could call it.
Yeah, and I definitely didn't go in that way, but I obviously came to understand a lot of that yogic philosophy after the fact. My journey was more about necessity. Like I needed a way out of a hard time I was in, and so I discovered letting go and like meditation, breath work, all these different things that helped me and supported me out of a position where self-improvement was no longer the right tools for the work.
Do you want to touch on that experience a bit and how the spiritual realms of self-improvement did pull you out of that?
Yeah, sure. So I experienced maybe months and months of ill health, both physically and mentally. I think there was some anxiety, there was gut issues. It was all very like emergent of the fact that I wasn't living like an aligned life at the time, and maybe I was deluding myself and ended up self-sabotaging in certain ways. And as much as I wanted to work out or eat healthy, I just none of those things like really had the level of, like I said, they were tools, but they weren't working, right? They weren't efficient, they weren't practical. And so I ended up searching. I was in this sort of searching state, like there must be a way I can get out of this. I always had this like very radical responsibility frame, so it was always like, okay, what next? What do I need to learn to get out of this?
I guess you like lent on all the tools that had served you before.
Yeah.
And none of them seemed to solve the problem for you.
Yeah, exactly. And so months, maybe even like a year or so of this, I discovered Wim Hof breathwork. I discovered David R. Hawkins and letting go, and all these. Even like I used the Waking Up app for like guided meditations at the time, which is not how I meditate at the moment. But it's interesting how certain tools get you out of certain places, and then you maybe discard them because they no longer serve you, and you move on to other tools. You explore different things.
That's the beautiful part of it, right? Is that a tool can take you to a certain level and can really serve you at a certain time in your journey.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean you have to cling on to it forever.
Yeah. For sure. But yeah, that's kind of all I wanted to talk on that. And so obviously I think I went into the deep end, and how I talk about it is obviously jumping into the deep end, because I didn't really have a lot of the quasi spiritual stuff, where it's like I feel like there is a sort of a deluded spiritual side of things, where if you get into it you start seeing people claiming to be spiritual or saying that certain things are more spiritual, but they're actually just like ways to inflate your ego in different ways, and more to identify with.
On what you mean by ego?
Yes,
that concept?
Yeah, so we've talked about like limiting belief and self-sabotage, which is other ways of talking about the ego. So to me, an ego is like a collection of all the things within you, within your mental structure, within your physical structure, within your energy structure, that are causing self-sabotage, they're causing misery, they're causing unhappiness, and it's the things you're craving to, the things you're attaching to, the things you're adverse to, you're fearful of, the maybe desires and pride, and all these sort of negative connotations or intentions that have cultivated through conditions or beliefs or programs.
Would you also describe it in some ways like a shadow part of yourself? Like a hidden part of you that's causing all these negative outcomes?
Yeah, well,
until you
Carl Jung says, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will run your life and you'll call it fate, sort of thing.
Yes, that is exactly what it feels like, I think, from my perspective.
And yeah, that is true. The ego has no power once you actually see it for what it is, and you let go of whatever the structures are, because they're just structures that are actually maintained by you unconsciously. And as soon as you become conscious of it and you stop maintaining these structures, they evaporate, they dissolve. Yeah, and that is the process of, I would say, liberation or enlightenment.
So the first step on that journey is accepting that you have these patterns and these beliefs that aren't serving you, and accepting that some of the things that you dislike about your life or ways that you show up, you're causing them. So you have to accept that. You have to really introspect and shed light on like what it is that's causing that within you, and accept that thing is there. Hugely,
yeah. I mean, this whole process is a practical, and maybe the most practical process. Like, people often confuse like spirituality with something that isn't practical or is like not useful in your actual life. And I would say that you've almost been misled. You've been talking or listening to something that hasn't been spirituality. It's been a quasi sort of a fake spiritual thing.
Yeah, so let's talk on some of those practical steps to bring it into a more practical frame. So you have that, you shed the light on it, you accept it, then what would you say is next?
So I have a few models, as you may probably can tell, but I would say letting go is probably the best place to start in terms of bringing it into your daily life. And if you aren't able to observe sensations and you get overly caught up, then you probably should be sitting down and training your awareness to be like non-judgmental and non-reactive.
So I guess you need the self-awareness first to identify the things. You need the mindfulness muscle, that skill, to actually be able to like pay attention to these things as well. So those are two like very fundamental skills that you should cultivate, and they're almost required before you have the ability to let go of things properly, right?
Yeah, for sure. So if you aren't meditating or you don't know what meditation is, even something as simple as focusing on your breath for a period of time, or and letting your mind maybe get distracted and it goes off on its own thought tangents, and then you bring yourself back to the present moment, back to your breath. And even something as simple as that is in effect training that mindfulness muscle, training that like presence muscle.
Yeah, a couple of things to say there. Like you said, it's very simple. Don't expect it to be easy, and it's okay that it's not easy to begin with.
Oh yeah.
And also it should be simple. Like, there's no need to overcomplicate it. If someone's telling you that in order to become mindful and meditate you need to do these special fancy
rituals
things,
or dogma, it's all irrelevant to some degree.
Yes, so unnecessary. So yeah, it can be simple. It's unlikely to be easy, but nothing easy really is worth having, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, I would recommend just simply sitting and witnessing as the first type of meditation, your breath is a really good anchor point to witness, or different sensations in your body. There's also some really good, useful, simple resources on things like YouTube for basic mindfulness meditation.
And for anyone who's a bit like me and wants to sort of dive in the deep end, I recently did like a Vipassana retreat. You can do like a 3-day or even a 10-day one, which I just did. And they obviously teach you all the principles from fundamentally like how to meditate, what is this process of purification via like self-observation. And yeah, you'll learn all the theory, but more importantly, you'll get to practice and you'll get to really like dive into the depths of the things holding you back. And I would recommend that to anyone and everyone who has the inclination, just in case, just putting it out there in case anyone does have the inclination.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to mine in a couple of months.
Yeah, Sophie's going on her first Vipassana retreat, I guess you would call it. I would call it a course now, in hindsight. I wouldn't call it a retreat. It's more of like a course. You're learning, you're showing up. It's a lot of work you're putting into it.
I guess the retreat aspect might be more this like curated, perfect environment for that.
Yeah.
Like you're retreating away from normal life to that specific environment.
Yeah.
I can't talk much on that.
I did want to talk on like an interesting conversation / concept I had where it's sort of related to clarity and how maybe spirituality makes you more clear. And what I mean by that is that you're seeing the world more for what it is, not like more about your opinions about the world. And so this concept of enlightenment often confuses people because they don't understand what it is. But if you've ever like had a paradigm shift in your own life where you've started seeing things for what it is, or you end up understanding something, that is like a hint at what clarity is. And so as you become, less opinionated about the world and you have less of these limits about the world, you end up seeing the world more how it is. And it may not be perfectly like a clear picture exactly how it is, because I think that would maybe be the theoretical end goal. But it's like this general process of like getting rid of all these lenses or distortions that you have about reality, and just removing them gradually, day by day, helps you show up in a more compassionate way. And somehow, like when you see things more clearly, they appear more beautiful, you end up being more loving. And so all these fear projections effectively that you had, or desireful projections, you get rid of these and you end up living a more fulfilled life. And I think it's almost like an amazing phenomenon that we've discovered this through like loads of like ancient wisdom has talked about this, but lots of current like gurus and scholars talk about this if you listen to the right people. And it's just that whole avenue of, hang on a sec, wait, as I'm seeing reality more clearly, I become more loving. It's kind of like a weird, not necessarily obvious thing. And it's like, I don't actually know the intricacies of why that happens, but it does seem to be how it works and how self-improvement works. You end up working on yourself, see the world more clearly, and you actualize more of your potential, and you become this more compassionate, unconditional, loving being, right? And maybe you had an opinion on that, or like a comment on that phenomenon.
I guess I like the sun and the clouds analogy of like, you have this light to give to the world, and your patterns and your programs are like clouds around this sun. And when you remove these clouds around the sun, you can also see more accurately and more clearly. You're no longer looking through this like distorted cloud that's like affecting what you see, and you're actually seeing the truth of what it is.
And in that analogy, it's like the sun is the light of consciousness or awareness, and the clouds is synonymous with ego or collection of things distorting your reality. And then you end up just shining that light of consciousness onto the world. You end up showing up with clarity and love and all these things that are that light of consciousness. Yeah, and it's weird how self-improvement, almost, if you take it to its logical conclusion, ends up with this sort of clarity, loving phenomenon of spirituality, which lots of people don't understand and sort of associate to lots of toxic things, or
I guess it's the dogma that comes attached to it, isn't it?
Yeah, well, okay, let's touch on that, actually, because
Okay.
I want to touch on maybe dogma. I'm going to touch a little bit on religion and prophets, but effectively, so I've gone through my own journey and explored religions of various sorts. I'm really invested in sort of Hinduism and the yogic cultures, and I just went on a Vipassana retreat, which is heavily Buddhist, but they don't like push any dogma, of course, because they're very like focused on the process, not the religion.
Or the tradition, almost.
And so, if you're not familiar with what dogma is like a set of beliefs or conditions that you're meant to follow, and so you start to see how like dogma is just like ego written in a book, and it's opinions and perceptions about the world that have been misinterpreted. But fundamentally, there is this like conclusion that I've come to, that people like Krishna in Hinduism, Buddha, or Jesus, they all taught the same thing to me. They all taught this like lesson of unconditional love, unconditional forgiveness, unconditional responsibility. It's all showing up as like the best version and this evolution sort of process, and they've obviously reached some sort of end goal where they're so loving, they're so open, that they have this impact on the world and other people around them. And I'm convinced that none of them would have wanted a book to be written or to people interpret their messages.
Or to have rules that you're supposed to follow.
Yeah, or rituals or rules or dogma. Like none of them would have wanted that. They would have wanted all the people that they spoke to have implemented the techniques that they're teaching, or the ways of showing up, or intentions that they're teaching.
Just be the most loving people they possibly can.
Yeah,
right?
and they would have wanted all these people to evolve and to become as loving as possible in some ways, and to improve themselves as much as possible. And I think that's what they would have wanted, and everything sort of around it is kind of, it gets in the way of the actual message, the actual teaching. And if any of them were here today, they would be teaching how to do this process. They would be teaching the fundamental aspect of it. They wouldn't say write a book and publish it and make sure everyone reads it and follows all these rules.
I think also with religion, from my experience, I think it is something that is easy for your ego to attach to in a way. Like, it gives you a sense of community, a sense of belonging, a sense of identity, a sense of like almost peace with like, okay, I will follow these rules and I'll fit in this box. And yeah, I think your ego can easily attach to that as well.
To me, it's like I'm very work orientated, but if there's this concept of inner work, this process that we've sort of been laying out here, if you're showing up and you're singing in a church, or you're reading a book, that's not the work. Like, that's not the inner work, that's not the transformation that's happening. And so anything that gets in the way of doing the work isn't the work. And
it's not necessarily bad. It's a beautiful thing.
I wouldn't say it's bad, but it's misleading in some ways, that they say like following certain rituals or following certain dogma is the path, and that's misleading. That's a distraction, and people end up showing up to church once a week and then the rest of their life, being alcoholic or something like that, and not doing the inner work and just completely distracting themselves.
And I think it's quite an individual journey as well. Like, it shouldn't ever be something that you're particularly shouting about, or it doesn't require anyone else. I think it's an individual journey. Yeah.
And with any of these sort of like realizations that we're talking about, everyone has to realize their own truth at their own pace, at their own time.
And it's different for everyone.
Yeah, everyone's going to come to their own conclusions. But as long as people are doing the work, that's kind of like the most important thing. And you can be on any level of understanding or comprehension, but you're putting in the work, you're trying to improve yourself, and it's just being cognizant of the fact that you may end up in spirituality is kind of what we're talking about. Kind of a weird thing that we've both noticed in our
goes that way.
Our journeys. Yeah, it's
one thing I'd like to touch on that I quite like your perspective on as well is that sometimes the intention and the shedding of light is all it really takes to start the momentum of like positive change. Particularly in undoing of beliefs, once you become aware that you have this belief or this distortion and you see it clearly for what it is, you accept it and you shed awareness on it, sometimes that's enough. Sometimes you watch that unravel before your eyes.
Yeah.
It's not always this hard graft and grind and like doing loads of things. Sometimes it's the being changes that are actually the most impactful.
Yeah, I think as you become more mindful of how you're showing up, you end up being able to literally see a belief or see a pattern of behaviour or a program that maybe someone placed there, and all of a sudden you see it for what it is, and it has, at that point on which you see it, it has no power over you anymore. Mm-hmm. It's like you've seen it and it's become nothing. It's no longer like a structure that's frozen. Yeah, and so I think that is a really interesting like mechanism of how that works. But also that's not always the case. Like the other half of that equation is like sometimes I don't understand what's going on or why I'm self-sabotaging in a certain way, and
you just have to keep showing up with that and sitting with that too. Yeah,
and then maybe there's like a really intense emotion that I'm feeling and I have no idea why, and I just have to sit with it. Like that is also what it looks like. So it comes in many shapes and sizes, and it looks very different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing actually on what you just mentioned there, you said something about how it unravels and then it no longer has power over you. I think one big shift that we both made in the beginning was away from the victim mindset and believing that things outside of us have power over us and we're just like a victim to them. I think that's a big mindset shift that makes this whole journey easier, is that ultimately you are the one that chooses. Like, you choose to be unhappy, you choose to be scared, you choose to be disturbed. You're totally in control of your internal reality, your internal state, and your reaction to anything. So the same thing can happen to multiple different people and they can have a completely different like outcome and reaction to it, because that's the thing that they have control over and the thing that they can choose.
Yeah.
Anything else you would add to around the victim mindset shift?
Yeah, I don't think I necessarily had that shift later on. That was a very early thing for me. Mm-hmm. I always noticed the opposite, obviously, is the growth mindset. So it's always like, I can grow from this or I can be a victim to this. Mm-hmm. And I think this is even more applicable in sort of what's more in the cultural zeitgeist, which is trauma. And people always like have this huge negative connotation to what is perceived as trauma. But you're either a victim of your trauma or you grow from your trauma. Mm-hmm. And when you say that, people are like, whoa, no dude, like I'm literally defined by my trauma. And I just think like, if you have an experience and you haven't learned from it,
then it defines you.
Then it defines you, then you're a victim to it. You're now living your life in accordance to that negative experience. Mm-hmm. And you haven't grown from it, you haven't learned from it. As soon as you grow and you learn from it, it's now no longer has power over you. You're no longer a victim to it. Yes. So to me, it's like, okay, what are these things that I've stored as trauma? Maybe in my body, maybe as a feeling, maybe as a thought, maybe as a belief, right? And so it's always coming back to like, okay, what have I not learned from? And then I'm always like, oh, I need to process this. I need to learn from this. And so there was something in the past, maybe an opinion about the future, that I haven't learned from. I haven't integrated into wisdom. It was all garbage that I collected, and it's holding me back.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the best ways to identify those things that are in your life, if you feel like you've accumulated things but you're not sure where or what they are, is things that you're afraid of. Like, those negative things often show up as fear.
Okay, it is craving and aversion, so it is things you're desiring and you're fearful of. That's all I would add to that, but yeah, I totally agree.
But yeah, I think fears are an easier place to start.
Yes.
Really, because they're easy to identify.
Yeah, I have a fear of that. I have a fear of this. I have a fear of that.
Yeah. Which are ultimately just choices. You're choosing to be afraid of those things.
Yeah, but
for some reason or another.
And maybe you had an experience that sort of justifies it. Maybe you don't. But either way, you can process that and choose to.
Yeah, I would try not to justify it as well. Otherwise, then you're allowing yourself to be like, oh, that's okay because this happened to me. I can be afraid of that. It's protecting me. It's serving me.
I don't think many people. So obviously we're in sort of a bit of an echo chamber with this sort of stuff. But I don't think a lot of people have that. I have this fear, and I can choose to transcend it. Like I can choose to move past it. Like most people, like I have a fear. That's it. I'm going to roll with that for the rest of my life, and that's generally
they're okay with it.
The practice. That's generally the anti-process, if you will.
Yeah, I've had that experience too. Like I've thought that if I let go of a fear of something, then that negative thing that I was afraid of is going to happen to me. In a way, like I'm trying to think of an example, but say I'm afraid of something that could eventually lead to me dying.
Being hit by a car.
Yeah, being hit by a car, let's use that example.
You're terrified.
And then I think if I let go of this fear of being hit by a car, then it's going to happen and I'm going to die. Like that, for some reason I have this belief that the fear is what's actually protecting me from that thing happening.
When it's actually...
It's making it worse. Like I'm attracting it to me, and I'm making it so that in any scenario, I'm less able to adapt. I go into a fear state where I can't react and overcome efficiently those scenarios. So yeah, it's almost doing the opposite, even though it can feel like it is helping in a way.
Yeah, because if you go back to like a physical analogy, more so with like a muscle and tension, you start to see that if you're holding tension, whether it be in the mind or in the body, you're actually weaker. You're actually less performant.
Yeah, and so it blocks the muscle almost.
You're sort of blocking your life by having these fears, and you're like being therefore less efficient, less productive.
Okay, I think we should wrap this up now because we've arrived into Lisbon, ready for a day to explore.
Yeah, it worked quite well in the car actually.
Yeah. Hopefully the audio wasn't too bad.
Cheers guys, thanks for listening to the first podcast. Sorry it was a bit rough and ready, but yeah, I'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching.
No worries, cheers, bye-bye.
Bye.